It was one of those calm Saturday mornings that seemed too good to waste inside. The sun had just started to rise above the rooftops, casting a soft golden glow across the quiet street. Birds were chirping. Kids' bikes leaned against driveways and sprinklers ticked rhythmically somewhere in the distance. It was the kind of morning that made you want to slow down, breathe, and just enjoy the peace. After years of long shifts, tense investigations, and sleepless nights at the station, Mark finally had the kind of morning he used to dream about. Retirement wasn't something he thought he'd ever get used to, but over the months he'd grown to appreciate the silence that used to feel strange. No radios crackling with reports. No sudden calls pulling him out of bed. Just calm. But today wasn't just another lazy Saturday. He had a mission of his own. A small one, but it mattered. Over the years, his garage had become a collection of forgotten things. Old tools he never used. Fishing rods from when his knees didn't ache so much. A pile of books that had followed him through 3 different homes, and boxes of stuff he didn't even remember buying. So he decided it was time for a garage sale. Not a big one. Just a simple neighborhood thing. A chance to clear out space, meet a few neighbors, and maybe earn enough cash for a nice dinner out. By 7 in the morning, he was already setting up folding tables on the driveway. His wife Ellen brought out a tray of coffee cups and a small speaker playing soft classic rock. Their daughter Lily helped sort through boxes, writing prices on little sticky notes. The air smelled of fresh-cut grass and coffee. "Let's put the books over here," Ellen suggested, pointing to the shaded side of the driveway. "Good call," Mark said, lifting a heavy box. "Don't want them frying in the sun. Learned that the hard way last time," Lily grinned. "Last time you ended up with melted candle wax all over your detective novels." "Hey," he said with a mock stern look, "those were vintage." The 3 of them laughed as they worked. The first hour was peaceful. Neighbors walking their dogs stopped to chat. A couple of kids on scooters peeked curiously at the table full of toys. An elderly couple down the street dropped by and left with an old radio Mark had fixed up years ago. It was exactly what he'd hoped for. Easy, friendly, and simple. Then she appeared, Karen Matthews. She lived 2 houses down, and everyone in the neighborhood knew her name. Not because she was friendly or helpful, but because she made sure everyone followed every little rule written in the HOA handbook. And even a few that weren't. She had a short blonde bob, large sunglasses that never seemed to come off, and a clipboard she carried like a badge. She was the kind of person who noticed if your grass grew half an inch too long, or if your trash can stayed out past 7:01 a.m. When Mark saw her walking toward him, that peaceful feeling began to fade a little. "Morning," he said. Forcing a polite smile, she didn't smile back. Her eyes darted from the tables to the open garage door to the cars parked along the street. "I wasn't aware we were allowed to hold garage sales here," she said in a tone that sounded more like an accusation than a question. Mark wiped his hands on a rag. "We are. Once a month, according to the HOA booklet." "I checked." Karen pursed her lips. "Well, that's funny because I don't recall receiving any notice. Usually people are supposed to inform the board ahead of time." "I'm not running a store," Mark said calmly. "Just getting rid of a few old things." Karen scribbled something on her clipboard. "I'll have to verify that. We've had issues with unapproved sales before. They attract unnecessary traffic." Lily exchanged a glance with her mom, trying not to roll her eyes. Ellen spoke gently, trying to diffuse the tension. "It's just a one-day thing, Karen. We'll be wrapped up by noon." Karen's lips curved into a tight smile. "Well, we'll see. Rules exist for a reason." Then she pulled out her phone and snapped a few photos of the setup, tables, signs, and even the garage interior. "Excuse me," Mark said, stepping forward slightly. "You mind not taking photos of my property?" "Just documenting," she said without looking up. "For record keeping." "Record keeping for what?" "For the HOA board," she replied briskly. "If everything's fine, you have nothing to worry about." Mark took a slow breath. Years of working as a detective had trained him to keep his voice even, no matter how irritating the situation. He wasn't about to let a neighborhood busybody ruin his morning. He gave her a polite nod. "Well, I appreciate your concern, but everything here is perfectly legal." Karen didn't answer. She just turned sharply and walked off, muttering something under her breath about people who think rules don't apply to them. Ellen sighed. "Every neighborhood has one," she said quietly. "Yeah," Mark replied, watching her leave. But not all of them have a clipboard. They chuckled softly and went back to arranging the tables, trying to shake it off. For a while, things returned to normal. People came and went, picking through boxes, chatting about old memories. Mark even managed to sell his old camping gear to a young couple who looked thrilled to have found it. But around 10 o'clock, a white SUV pulled up across the street. The side of it had the city's code enforcement logo printed in blue. A man stepped out wearing a uniform shirt and a polite smile. "Morning," he said, approaching the driveway. "Are you the homeowner?" "Yes, sir," Mark said, wiping his hands again. "Something I can help you with?" The officer glanced around the tables, his expression more curious than stern. "We got a call about an unlicensed sale, possibly commercial activity on residential property." Mark sighed quietly. "Let me guess who called." The officer gave a small, sympathetic shrug. "I'm not supposed to share that information, but let's just say it's a familiar name." Ellen stepped over, holding a paper cup. "Coffee? You look like you've had a few of these calls already today." The man smiled gratefully. "Wouldn't say no to that. And don't worry, this looks fine to me. I just need to check a few things for the report." Mark showed him the HOA rules on his phone, pointing out the clause about private sales. "It's once per month under 8 hours. No permits needed unless it's ongoing." The officer nodded. "Yep, that's the same guideline we use." "You're completely in the clear," Lily whispered to her dad. "Does that mean we can keep going?" "Sure does," he said with a smile. The officer filled out a short form, took a couple of photos, and handed Mark a copy. "Sorry for the interruption, sir. We get these kinds of calls all the time. Usually it's just one person in the neighborhood who takes things." "Very seriously," Mark chuckled. "That's one way to put it." Before leaving, the officer added quietly, "Between you and me, I've been to this street 3 times this year. Always the same complaint. You seem like the kind of guy who can handle it." "Appreciate it," Mark said. As the SUV drove away, Ellen shook her head. "Unbelievable. She actually called the city on you." "Doesn't surprise me," Mark said. "Some people just need something to control." But Karen wasn't done. Not 10 minutes later, her voice carried down the street, sharp and shrill. "You can't block the sidewalk like that." She was standing near the end of the driveway, pointing at a table of books that was at least 2 feet from the walkway. "It's not blocked," Mark said calmly. "It's close enough," she snapped. "Someone could trip." "And your sign on the corner? That's public property. You can't put signs there without approval." "I put it at the stop sign so people could find us," he said. "No harm done." "It's against the HOA rules," she said firmly. "I've already taken it down," Mark frowned. "You took it down?" She crossed her arms. "Yes, you're welcome." Mark stared for a moment, fighting the urge to laugh. He couldn't believe it. She had actually removed his sign from the street corner. "Karen," he said, steady and calm, "you don't have the authority to touch other people's property." "I do when it's violating community standards," she said, adjusting her sunglasses. "And you should be grateful. I'm saving you from a fine." Ellen stepped forward, her voice still kind but firm. "We appreciate your concern, but we're managing fine." Karen's eyes narrowed. "You might want to check your attitude. I'll be reporting this to the HOA board first thing Monday." Then she turned and walked away, her clipboard tucked under her arm like a trophy. Mark watched her go, his patience wearing thinner by the second. He wasn't angry, not really. He'd dealt with worse in his years on the job. Angry suspects, false witnesses, people who'd tried every trick to get under his skin. Compared to that, Karen was just noise. Still, there was something about her smugness that rubbed him the wrong way. As the day went on, Mark couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end of it. Karen kept reappearing, from her porch, from her window, from across the street, watching, filming, writing notes. At one point, a neighbor named Tony stopped by, shaking his head. "You've got patience, man. She reported me last month for having my Christmas lights up too long." "What did you do?" Mark asked. "I took them down and then put up Halloween ones just to mess with her," Tony said with a grin. Mark laughed. "You're brave." "Nah, just tired of her bossing everyone around. Whole street's scared of her clipboard." Mark smiled but said nothing. His mind was already turning over the situation, not as a neighbor, but as a detective. Years of instinct told him when someone's behavior was just annoyance and when it was something deeper. Karen's need for control wasn't just about rules. There was something obsessive about it, almost personal. When the garage sale finally ended around noon, Mark felt both satisfied and drained. They'd sold most of the items, met some nice people, and earned a few $100s. But the lingering tension from Karen's constant interference had dulled the joy a little. As he packed up the last few boxes, he glanced down the street. Karen was on her porch again, phone in hand, talking animatedly to someone. Maybe another board member, maybe just another complaint line. Ellen noticed too. Think she'll let it go? Mark looked at her, a small smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. Not a chance. He closed the garage door slowly, his mind already ticking. He didn't plan to start trouble, but something told him that trouble had already found him, and the detective in him, the one who'd spent decades reading people, studying patterns, following trails, and wasn't about to ignore it. For now, though, he poured himself a cup of coffee, sat on the porch with Ellen, and watched the sun dip behind the houses. The neighborhood looked peaceful again, almost normal, but Mark knew better. In his experience, quiet streets often hid the loudest stories, and it looked like his own driveway had just become one of them. The next morning started off quiet, almost too quiet. Mark was halfway through his first cup of coffee when Ellen came into the kitchen, holding her phone with an uneasy look. You might want to see this, she said. He took the phone. On the neighborhood app, a new post was climbing fast. Dozens of comments and reactions. The post title read, Unauthorized Garage Sale Violation, Community Disruption. Mark didn't even have to open it to know who wrote it. Karen's name sat right there under the post. The message went on for several paragraphs. She complained about unapproved commercial activity, increased traffic, and safety hazards. She even attached the photos she'd taken the day before, tables, cars, people browsing. At the end, she wrote, This kind of behavior sets a bad example for the rest of our community. Rules are rules. Mark sighed and handed the phone back. She really has nothing better to do. Ellen frowned. People are actually commenting, though. Look, some neighbors defended him, saying it was harmless and kind of fun. Others, though, joined in about rules needing to be followed. A few just posted popcorn emojis, waiting for the drama to unfold. Mark rubbed his temple. This is exactly why I avoid social media. You're trending in your own neighborhood, Ellen said, trying to lighten the mood. He gave her a look. Great, just what I needed in retirement, a fan club. A knock at the door interrupted them. When Mark opened it, Tony stood there holding a mug of coffee and grinning. You've seen it, huh? He said. Mark nodded. Just did. Don't worry about her, Tony said. She does this every few months. Last time she posted about me leaving my ladder out overnight. Claimed it was an eyesore, Mark chuckled. Guess she's keeping herself busy. Oh, she's got plenty of time. Doesn't work. Her husband's always traveling. She's basically the HOA watchdog. Mark leaned against the doorframe. I can handle a watchdog. It's when they start biting that I pay attention. Tony smirked. You sound like you're back on duty, Chief. Mark grinned faintly. Force of habit. After Tony left, Mark tried to shake it off. He had plans to work on the garden and maybe clean the gutters. But every few minutes his mind went back to that post. Something about it bothered him. Not just because it was petty, but because it was so public. He'd seen situations like this spiral before. Small neighborhood disputes that turned into ugly online fights. He wasn't about to feed that fire, but he also didn't like being misrepresented. By mid-afternoon, he decided to stop by the HOA office. It wasn't far, just a small brick building near the community pool. Inside, a young receptionist smiled at him. Good afternoon, sir. Can I help you? Yes, Mark said kindly. I'd like to speak to whoever's handling community complaints. Name's Mark Hensley. She checked a clipboard. You're in Willow Bend Estates, right? Let me see. Ah, yes. That would be Mrs. Parker. She's in her office. One moment, please. A minute later, a woman in her 50s came out. She looked polite but weary, like someone who'd had a long week. Mr. Hensley, good to meet you. Come on in. Her office was neat with framed photos of local events and a shelf full of HOA binders. She motioned for him to sit. I'm guessing this is about the garage sale complaint? She said, half smiling. Mark nodded. You guessed right, she sighed. Karen's been active lately, I figured, he said. I just want to make sure everything's clear. I followed the guidelines. 1-day sale, no permits needed, no street blockage. Mrs. Parker nodded. You're fine. I checked the bylaws myself this morning. You didn't violate anything. Then why's there a complaint? Because Karen likes to interpret the rules her own way, she said delicately. Technically, she's allowed to file a report, but it doesn't mean it holds weight. She tends to overstep. Mark smiled faintly. That's one word for it. Mrs. Parker leaned forward. Between you and me, you're not the first person she's gone after. I've had at least 10 separate reports from her in the past year. Everything from paint colors to garden gnomes. Garden gnomes? She said they were unsightly. Mark laughed quietly. You've got quite the neighborhood politics here. Oh, you have no idea, Mrs. Parker said. We try to keep peace, but she takes her enforcement role a bit too seriously. She's not even on the board officially anymore. She just likes to act like she is. That caught Mark's attention. She's not on the board? Not since last spring. She was asked to step down after an incident. Nothing major, just disagreements Mark didn't push. But in his mind, that detail mattered. A person who lost power but kept pretending to have it. That was always a recipe for trouble. Mrs. Parker smiled reassuringly. Don't worry, Mr. Hensley, I'll handle it. You don't have to respond to her post. Most people know how she is. Appreciate it, Mark said, standing. Just wanted to make sure I wasn't crazy. Not at all. If anything, you've been more patient than most. He thanked her and left. But as he walked back to his car, he noticed a familiar white SUV parked a few spaces down. Karen's. She was sitting in the driver's seat, talking on her phone, waving her hands as if arguing with someone. When she spotted him, her expression shifted. She gave him a stiff nod, started her car and drove off without a word. By the time he got home, Ellen could see that something was on his mind. She was there, wasn't she? Ellen asked. Yep, Mark said, setting his keys down. Probably filing another complaint. Ellen sighed. Can't you just ignore her? I can, he said. But I have a feeling she's not going to ignore me. That night, while Ellen and Lily watched a movie, Mark sat in his small home office with a notepad. Old habits kicked in. He started jotting down details, dates, times, incidents. It wasn't that he planned to start anything, but documenting helped him think clearly. He'd seen people like Karen before, people who believed authority was their personal weapon. They'd twist rules, intimidate others, and justify it as just doing their duty. But deep down, it was about control. The next morning, the pattern continued. Karen was standing outside when Mark went to get the mail. She gave him a tight smile. I hope you've learned something from yesterday's situation. He paused. Excuse me? She tilted her head. Not everyone appreciates unnecessary activity in the neighborhood. We have standards, you know. Mark folded his arms. I do know. I read the handbook. Good, she said. Then you'll also know there's a rule against leaving boxes or clutter in plain view for more than 24 hours. Your driveway still has some things from yesterday. He glanced toward the garage. A couple of folded tables leaned near the door, waiting for pickup. You mean those? He asked. Yes, she said sharply. I've already documented them. He exhaled slowly. Karen, you realize this is starting to look like harassment, right? Her eyes widened slightly, but she recovered fast. Excuse me? I'm simply protecting our community. You're welcome. Protecting it from what? Folding tables? She frowned. From people who think rules don't matter. Rules matter, he said calmly. So does common sense. For a moment, they just stood there. Two neighbors a few feet apart, the air heavy with tension. Then Karen turned sharply and walked away, muttering something about disciplinary action. Mark shook his head. He wasn't angry. He was curious now. Curious in the same way he used to be when a case didn't add up. That afternoon, he made a few quiet phone calls. Not official, just friendly ones. He still had contacts at the local department, and one of them worked in code enforcement. Hey, Hensley, the man said when he picked up. Retirement treating you okay? Can't complain, Mark said. Quick question for you. Do you happen to have a record of complaints filed for Willow Bend Estates this year? The man laughed. Oh, you mean your neighborhood's most active reporter? Yeah, I know the one, Mark smiled. Karen Matthews? That's the one. She's filed, let me see, 17 reports this year alone, mostly minor stuff. Unpainted fences, trash cans left out, barking dogs. None of them led to fines. Any recent ones? Yep. Yesterday's about your garage sale. Marked as resolved. We noted no violation, Mark leaned back. Appreciate it. Just needed to confirm. No problem. You planning to file a counter? Not yet, Mark said. Just gathering facts. When he hung up, Ellen peeked into the room. You're investigating, aren't you? He smiled. Force of habit. She crossed her arms, half amused, half concerned. Just don't start an all-out war with her. I won't, he said. But if she keeps this up, she might start one herself. That evening, as the sun dipped low, Mark noticed something odd. A few of his neighbors were walking by slower than usual, giving polite nods but curious looks. Word had clearly spread. He wasn't angry at them. People talked and neighborhoods thrived on gossip. But he didn't like being at the center of it. When he checked the community app again, he noticed Karen's post had vanished, deleted, but a new one appeared in its place, this time from the HOA's official account. It read, "We would like to remind all residents that one-day personal sales are permitted within community guidelines. Please be respectful of your neighbors and avoid posting unverified complaints." Mark couldn't help but smile. Mrs. Parker had handled it exactly right. Still, the quiet didn't last. The following morning, Mark found a printed notice taped to his mailbox. It wasn't from the HOA, it was handwritten on lined paper. Consider this your warning. Repeated violations will result in formal action. No signature, but he didn't need one. He folded the paper slowly and slipped it into his pocket. Later, when he told Ellen, she looked uneasy. She left that? Who else would? What are you going to do? Mark thought for a moment. I'm not going to argue, but I'm not going to sit quietly either. He spent the rest of the day watching, not obsessively but carefully. He noticed how often Karen patrolled the street, how she paused at certain houses, how she took photos. She wasn't just being nosy. She was tracking people, collecting information. He started talking to neighbors, casually at first. A pattern emerged. Karen had reported Tony for a ladder, a retired teacher for having too many bird feeders, a family down the block for parking violations that didn't exist. Everyone was tired of her, but no one wanted confrontation. Mark, however, wasn't afraid of confrontation as long as it was done the right way. That night, he sat in his office again, the old detective instincts sharpening. He opened a folder on his computer and began saving screenshots. Her posts, her comments, photos of the notice she'd left. He wasn't planning to use it yet, but he wanted everything in one place. Ellen came in quietly and set a cup of tea beside him. You're really doing this, huh? He smiled without looking up. Just collecting facts. Like the old days. She leaned against the doorway. What happens when she realizes who she's dealing with? Mark looked up then, eyes calm but steady. Then maybe she'll finally learn that not every rule enforcer is the one in charge. Outside, the street was calm again. The houses glowed under porch lights, the air still and soft. But somewhere down the block, behind those perfectly trimmed hedges, a woman with a clipboard was planning her next move, and Mark, the man she'd just called a violator, was quietly preparing his own. The next few days passed with an odd sort of tension hanging over the neighborhood. Nothing dramatic happened, but something had changed. People waved politely at Mark, but he could sense the whispering. He'd lived among them long enough to notice when people avoided eye contact or cut conversations short. He didn't blame them. Small communities had their own rhythm. One person stirred trouble and everyone else quietly stepped back until it passed. The thing was, Mark had no intention of letting this one just pass. By Thursday morning, he had a small file growing in his office drawer. Nothing official, just notes, dates, and a few printouts. He'd written down the time of each run-in with Karen, screenshots of her deleted posts, even the photo of that anonymous warning note she'd taped to his mailbox. He wasn't trying to start something. He just wanted to be ready, in case she did. Ellen came in as he was sorting through papers. "You're building a case file, aren't you?" she said with a hint of amusement. He smiled faintly. "Old habits die hard. You sure this isn't a little too much?" "I'm sure," he said calmly. "I've seen people like her before. If you ignore them, they take that as permission to keep going." Ellen sighed and leaned against the doorframe. "I just don't want this to turn into a war, Mark." "It won't," he said softly. "But she's crossed the line from nosy to dangerous. That note wasn't just petty. It was meant to intimidate. Ellen looked uneasy but didn't argue. She knew him too well. When Mark got that quiet, focused look in his eyes, it meant his detective instincts had taken over. That afternoon he took a slow walk around the neighborhood. Not suspiciously, not sneaking, just casual like any neighbor out for a stroll. He nodded to people, smiled at kids playing ball, and took mental notes. He noticed Karen's house, same as always. Neat, manicured, not a single leaf out of place. The blinds were half closed, but through the gap, he caught a flicker of movement, her shadow pacing near the window. He kept walking. At the end of the block, he stopped to chat with an older woman named June, who was watering her flowers. "Morning, June," he said. "How are those tulips holding up?" "Oh, they're doing fine," she said cheerfully. "Though if you ask Karen, she'd say I planted them too close to the walkway." Mark smiled. "She's mentioned that to you too." June rolled her eyes. "Honey, she's mentioned everything to everyone. Last week she told me I should get rid of my bird bath because it attracts pests. Can you believe that? I've had that bird bath for 15 years. "Sounds like she's keeping busy," Mark said lightly. June lowered her watering can and leaned in a little. "You know, she used to be on the HOA board. Got removed after some argument about the community newsletter. I don't know all the details, but I heard she accused someone of misusing funds. Turned out she was wrong." Mark nodded thoughtfully. "That tracks with what I've heard." June looked at him closely. "You're not planning to go head-to-head with her, are you?" He smiled. "Let's just say I'm planning not to be pushed around." "Good," June said. About time someone did. As he walked home, Mark thought about what June said. It wasn't just about the garage sale anymore. Karen had a pattern. She'd been going after people for years and no one had ever stopped her. Most folks just wanted peace, so they ignored it. But ignoring people like her only gave them more power. That evening, when the sun dipped low and the air cooled, Mark sat on the porch with his laptop. He searched the HOA's website and found the board meeting minutes from previous years. His old habits made him notice details others might overlook. Repeated mentions of resident concerns, unauthorized inspections, and policy enforcement issues. Each one linked to resident KM. It was all right. There ends a breadcrumb trail of her meddling. Closed the laptop and leaned back, staring at the darkening street. The streetlights flickered on one by one, casting long shadows across the pavement. Somewhere a dog barked. A sprinkling system clicked on, and then, down the street, he saw her. Karen, walking briskly, phone in hand, flashlight on. She paused in front of a house, crouched, took a picture, then moved to the next one. Mark exhaled slowly. He'd seen people document things before, witnesses, officers, even suspects. The difference was intent. Karen wasn't protecting anyone. She was collecting ammunition. The next morning, he decided to stop being passive. He called the HOA office again. Mrs. Parker answered, sounding tired but polite. "Good morning." "Mrs. Parker, it's Mark Hensley again." "Oh, hello, Mr. Hensley. How can I help you?" "I just wanted to give you a heads up," he said. "That issue with Karen isn't over. She's been leaving notes, taking photos of people's homes. She might be crossing into harassment territory." There was a pause on the line. Then Mrs. Parker sighed. "I believe you. You're not the first to say that. But unless someone files a formal complaint, we can't take action." "I understand," Mark said. "Consider this a formal notice, then." Mrs. Parker hesitated, then said quietly, "Between us, I'll start a record. If others come forward too, we can address it at the next board meeting." "Appreciate it," Mark said. After hanging up, he decided to go one step further. He called his friend at the city office again. "Hey, you got a second?" Mark asked. "Sure thing." "What's up?" "I'm looking into repeated false reports from one resident. Anything you can tell me about that process?" The man chuckled. "You mean Karen Matthews again?" "Yeah, she's on our radar. The department's received multiple bogus complaints from her. Nothing serious enough to fine her yet, but she's testing limits." "You thinking of filing something?" "Not yet," Mark said. "But keep me posted if she keeps calling in nonsense." "Will do," his friend said. "You sure you're retired? Sounds like you're still running cases." Mark laughed softly. "Just can't help myself." That night, Ellen made a pot of tea and joined him on the porch again. "So what's the next step, detective?" She teased gently. "Observation," he said with a faint grin. "Always start with observation." Over the next week, Mark quietly kept watch. He didn't stalk or snoop, he just noticed. Karen's routines were easy to track. Morning jog, midday calls from her porch, afternoon inspections with her clipboard. She always stopped at certain houses. She never looked people in the eye, but she noticed everything else. One afternoon, while Mark was trimming his hedges, Karen approached again, phone in hand. "Good afternoon," she said stiffly. "Afternoon," he replied. "I see you've trimmed your bushes," she said, glancing at the hedge trimmer. "That's the idea." "They're still an inch over the HOA standard height," she said. Mark blinked. "You measured them?" "I have an eye for detail," she said proudly. "And I take community upkeep seriously." "Do you also take enjoyment in annoying your neighbors?" She frowned. "Excuse me?" "You heard me," he said calmly. "I'm all for community standards, but you're not the HOA. You don't get to enforce rules you don't even have authority over." Her jaw tightened. "If the board won't do their job, someone has to." "And you appointed yourself?" "I'm protecting property values," she said sharply. "By harassing residents?" She crossed her arms. "If people followed the rules, I wouldn't have to intervene." Mark studied her for a moment. "You ever stop to think maybe you're the reason people don't like living here anymore?" She flushed. "You're out of line." "Maybe," he said evenly. "But at least I'm not pretending to be in charge." She turned and stormed off, muttering something he didn't catch. That night, Mark sat with his notes again. He'd learned something important from that conversation. Karen genuinely believed she was doing the right thing. It wasn't about malice. It was about power mixed with insecurity. That combination was always volatile. A few days later, things escalated. Mark was fixing a loose board on his backyard fence when he heard footsteps. When he turned, Karen was standing near the corner of his yard, just outside the property line, phone raised, snapping pictures. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice low and calm. She didn't answer right away. "There's debris falling into the shared easement," she said finally. "It's a violation." "It's sawdust," he said. "From fixing my fence." "I'm documenting it," she said flatly. "Get off my property," he said, not loud but firm. "I'm not on your property," she snapped. "This is community land." Mark stepped closer, staying composed. "You're about 1 foot from trespassing, and for your sake, I'd recommend you take that camera somewhere else." She hesitated, then turned and walked away, muttering into her phone. Ellen came out just as Karen disappeared around the corner. "Please tell me she's not doing what I think she's doing." "She's documenting sawdust," he said dryly. Ellen shook her head. "You can't make this stuff up." That evening, Mark received an email from the HOA. It was an official notice about property maintenance concerns, complete with attached photos that were clearly taken by Karen. Ellen looked over his shoulder. "She actually filed it?" "Of course she did. What are you going to do?" Mark leaned back in his chair. "Handle it my way." The next day, he printed his evidence, the mailbox note, the timestamps, her photos, the record of her previous false reports, and a copy of her deleted post. He placed them all neatly into a folder labeled Harassment Documentation. Then he called Mrs. Parker again. "I'd like to schedule a meeting with the board," he said calmly. "About the complaint?" she asked. "About the complainer," he replied. 2 days later, he walked into the HOA office, folder in hand. The board members were seated around a small table, polite but curious. Karen sat off to the side, looking smug, a thick binder resting in her lap. "Mr. Hensley," Mrs. Parker said, "thank you for coming. We understand there's been some ongoing tension." Mark nodded. "That's one way to put it. I wanted to clarify a few things and provide some evidence." Karen interrupted. "I've already submitted my report." "I'm sure you have," Mark said evenly. "But this isn't about your report. It's about a pattern." He opened the folder and laid out his papers, photos, printouts, notes. "These are records of false complaints, harassment, and privacy violations. Not just toward me, but several neighbors. I also have confirmation from the city office of multiple unfounded reports made by this same resident." The room went quiet. Karen's confident smile faltered slightly. Mrs. Parker looked through the documents, her brow furrowing. "These are serious, Mr. Hensley." "They are," he said. "And as someone who spent 30 years in law enforcement, I can tell you this behavior doesn't just go away on its own." Karen crossed her arms. "You're exaggerating. I was just following the rules." Mark looked at her steadily. "No, you were following people. There's a difference." Silence filled the room for a long moment. Finally, Mrs. Parker said quietly, "We'll review this and get back to you soon." Mark nodded and stood. "Thank you for your time." As he walked out, he caught a glimpse of Karen's face, the first hint of uncertainty he'd seen since this all began. That night, sitting on the porch with Ellen, he felt a strange mix of relief and anticipation. "She didn't see it coming, did she?" Ellen said softly. He shook his head. "Not yet, but she will." The stars glimmered above, quiet and steady. For the first time in weeks, the air felt a little lighter. Karen might have started this mess, but Mark was finally taking control of it, and he wasn't about to stop now. The following week started quietly, almost too quietly. The air in the neighborhood felt lighter, but Mark knew better. Karen was the kind of person who didn't give up easily. When people like her felt cornered, they usually pushed back harder before they broke. It had been 3 days since the HOA meeting. No updates, no new notices, no more photos being taken in plain sight. For the first time in a while, Mark enjoyed his morning coffee without glancing toward her house. The birds were back near the trees. The kids rode their bikes again, and the street felt normal. But on the fourth morning, that changed. Mark opened his mailbox and found another envelope, this time printed neatly, not handwritten. It was from the HOA. Inside was a short notice. "We have received multiple reports regarding unpermitted construction and disturbances at your address. Please respond within 7 days." Ellen read it over his shoulder and sighed. "She's still at it, isn't she?" He nodded slowly. "She's doubling down. Are you going to call Mrs. Parker again?" He folded the letter carefully and slipped it back into the envelope. "No, I'm going to wait." Sometimes, silence spoke louder than arguments. Mark wanted Karen to think she'd regained the upper hand, to grow confident enough to make her biggest mistake. That afternoon, while Ellen went to visit her sister, Mark stayed home. He sat in his office with the blinds open, quietly watching the street. The clock ticked softly in the background. Around 3, he saw her. Karen came out of her house, wearing her usual visor and carrying a small notebook. She stopped in front of each home, jotting something down, then paused across from his driveway. Her gaze lingered on his house. He didn't move. She lifted her phone, took a photo, then scribbled more notes. Her eyes flicked toward his window, but he stayed still. After a few moments, she turned and walked away. He exhaled, leaning back in his chair. "Got you," he murmured quietly. Later that night, as he reviewed his home security footage, he saw it all again, clear as day. The photos, the lingering, the note-taking. He clipped the footage and saved it to his growing file. He didn't plan to humiliate her. He wanted accountability. There was a difference. 2 days later, Mrs. Parker called. "Mr. Hensley, I wanted to update you on your submission. The board reviewed your materials and has scheduled a private session to discuss your concerns." "When is it?" "Next Tuesday at 6. We'd appreciate your attendance." "I'll be there," he said. "And, Mr. Hensley," she added, hesitating. "Off the record, thank you for how you've handled this. Most people would have lost their temper long ago." Mark smiled faintly. Experience teaches patience. When he hung up, Ellen walked in holding 2 mugs of tea. "Let me guess. Meeting scheduled?" "Next Tuesday." She handed him his cup. "Good. Maybe this will finally end." He looked thoughtful. "I think it's about to get interesting." The weekend came and went uneventfully. Karen kept her distance, but Mark noticed her blinds moving whenever he stepped outside. The tension between their houses was almost invisible, yet you could feel it in the air like static before a storm. By Monday, whispers were spreading. June from down the street waved at him while watering her flowers and said quietly, "Heard something big's coming tomorrow. You didn't hear that from me." Mark smiled. Wouldn't dream of it. That night, he went through his file one more time. Everything was there. Dates, photos, records, even a list of other residents who'd quietly reached out after hearing about the meeting. Apparently, Karen had left a trail of unhappy neighbors for years. People were finally ready to speak up. Tuesday arrived. The meeting was held in the small HOA community room near the park. When Mark arrived, the room was half full, residents whispering quietly among themselves. Karen sat near the front, binder in her lap, wearing her usual air of authority. Mrs. Parker and the other board members were at the long table, papers neatly arranged. When everyone settled, Mrs. Parker cleared her throat. "Thank you all for coming. This special session is to address multiple reports regarding community conduct and property concerns." She glanced briefly at Mark, then at Karen. Karen spoke first, voice steady but sharp. "I appreciate the board finally taking my complaints seriously. I've been documenting numerous violations for months. Unpermitted sales, improper landscaping, trash bins left out past collection day. It's been very disappointing to see the lack of enforcement." Mark stayed silent, listening. Karen flipped open her binder and began listing things in that same clipped, superior tone. She even mentioned his garage sale again, twisting the story to make it sound like he'd disrupted the neighborhood. The room was silent except for the sound of her turning pages. When she finally stopped, Mrs. Parker nodded politely. "Thank you, Ms. Matthews. Now, Mr. Hensley, would you like to respond?" Mark stood, calm and composed. "Yes, ma'am." He walked to the table and placed his folder down. "First, I'd like to thank the board for hearing me out. I moved here because I liked the peace and sense of community. But lately, that peace has been interrupted, not by actual problems, but by one person's attempts to control everyone else." Karen shifted in her seat but said nothing. Mark opened his folder and began laying out pages one by one. "Here are time-stamped photos showing Ms. Matthews taking unauthorized pictures of residents' homes. Here's a copy of a note she left on my mailbox. Here's documentation of false reports made to the HOA and city offices. And here," he slid a USB drive across the table, "is video footage from my security camera showing her taking those photos without consent." A quiet murmur spread through the room. Mrs. Parker looked through the papers, her expression tightening. This is quite a lot." Karen's voice cracked slightly. "He's making it sound worse than it is. I was simply doing what the board failed to do." Mark met her eyes calmly. "You are doing what no one asked you to do. You've been intimidating your neighbors, spreading false accusations, and wasting community resources. That's not protecting the neighborhood. That's harassment." The room stayed silent for a long moment. Finally, one of the board members, a tall man named Henry, spoke up. "We've actually received similar complaints from others. You're not the only one, Mr. Hensley." Mrs. Parker nodded slowly. "That's true. In fact, several residents have submitted statements supporting what you've just shown us." Karen looked around, clearly startled. "They're exaggerating. I've only ever tried to maintain order." June raised her hand from the back of the room. "Order doesn't mean spying on people, dear. You've been making us all miserable." A few others nodded in agreement. Karen's face turned red. "You all don't appreciate the work I've done. Without me, this place would fall apart." Mark spoke softly but firmly. "Karen, the neighborhood doesn't need a warden. It needs neighbors." The words hung in the air for a moment. Mrs. Parker cleared her throat. "The board will deliberate privately. Everyone, please step outside while we discuss." As people filed out, Karen shot Mark a glare. "You think this is over? You don't scare me." He smiled faintly. "Good. I'm not trying to." Outside, small groups formed, whispering quietly. Some residents patted Mark's shoulder or nodded in approval. It was clear he wasn't alone anymore. After about 20 minutes, the board called everyone back in. Mrs. Parker spoke carefully, her voice calm but firm. After reviewing the evidence and speaking with multiple residents, the board has decided on several actions. First, the complaint filed by Ms. Matthews against Mr. Hensley is dismissed. Second, effective immediately, Ms. Matthews is issued a formal warning for harassment and misuse of HOA authority. Continued behavior of this nature will result in fines and possible legal referral. A collective exhale went through the room. Karen's mouth fell open. "You can't be serious, I've done nothing wrong." Mrs. Parker's tone softened, but she didn't waver. "Karen, this community values harmony. We've received enough evidence to show that your actions have caused distress to several residents. We encourage you to take this as an opportunity to step back and rebuild trust." Karen stood abruptly, her binder slamming shut. "This is outrageous. You're all against me." She stormed out of the room, her footsteps echoing down the hallway. Silence followed for a moment. Then Henry, the board member, looked at Mark and said, "Well handled. I've seen plenty of arguments here, but that might be the calmest takedown I've ever witnessed." Mark smiled modestly. "Just doing what's fair." When the meeting ended, people gathered around him, shaking his hand and thanking him. Some shared their own small stories, Karen's comments about their paint colors, her habit of peeking into backyards, her endless complaints, as Mark and Ellen walked home under the glow of the streetlights. She smiled faintly. "Looks like the neighborhood found its voice tonight." He nodded. "Sometimes it just takes one person to push back." For the first time in weeks, their home felt peaceful again. The next morning, there were no new letters, no photos, no watchful eyes from across the street. Karen's blinds stayed closed. Over the next few days, life went on. Kids played in the cul-de-sac again. Neighbors stopped to chat without glancing nervously toward her house. Even June seemed cheerier, humming while tending her flowers. One evening, while Mark was putting away some tools in the garage, he saw Karen's husband walking his dog down the street. The man looked tired, eyes downcast, but when he reached Mark's driveway, he paused. "Evening," he said quietly. "Evening," Mark replied. The man hesitated, then said, "I just wanted to say, I'm sorry about all that. She gets carried away sometimes." Mark nodded gently. "I understand. I don't hold it against you." The man gave a small, grateful nod and continued walking. Ellen came out a moment later, wiping her hands on a towel. "Was that her husband?" "Yeah," Mark said. "Seems like he's caught in the middle too." "Maybe this'll be a wake-up call for her," Ellen said hopefully. "Maybe," Mark replied. "But even if it isn't, at least the rest of the neighborhood won't have to walk on eggshells anymore." He stood there for a moment, watching the quiet street. The autumn air was crisp, the leaves rustling gently in the breeze. He thought about his years on the force, the hundreds of people he'd dealt with, the conflicts he'd seen unfold. This one had been different, though. Smaller, yes, but just as revealing. Power didn't always wear a badge or carry authority. Sometimes it hid behind neighborhood rules and polite smiles, and justice didn't always come from a courtroom. Sometimes it came from standing your ground, with patience, evidence, and quiet strength. That night, as he turned off the porch light and locked the door, he felt lighter. The house was peaceful, the street calm. For once, retirement really did feel like peace. But deep down, he knew this wasn't quite the end. People like Karen rarely disappeared quietly. They always had one more move to play, and when that move came, Mark would be ready. The days following the HOA meeting felt peaceful in a way that almost felt strange. For the first time in months, Mark didn't feel that constant tension in his shoulders whenever he walked outside. He could mow the lawn without feeling eyes on him, could chat with neighbors without someone lurking around with a clipboard. The air just felt lighter. Even the mail became boring again. Bills, flyers, and the occasional grocery ad. No warnings. No notices. No envelopes with bold HOA stamps. Ellen noticed the change too. She seemed happier, humming while cooking, planting new flowers near the front porch. "Feels like the neighborhood can breathe again," she said one morning, watering her lilies. "Yeah," Mark said. "Took a while, but peace was worth it." Karen's house remained quiet. The blinds were usually drawn, the car hardly moved. A few times Mark caught sight of her husband walking the dog, always polite but quick to pass by. Karen herself hadn't been seen much at all. Still, Mark didn't relax completely. Years of experience had taught him that calm often came before another wave. People didn't change overnight, especially people who believed they were always right. About 2 weeks later, his phone buzzed one morning while he was in the garage fixing a loose shelf. It was a text from Mrs. Parker. "Hi, Mark. Just letting you know the board is holding a follow-up meeting next week. You're welcome to attend. There's been another development." He frowned slightly and texted back, "What kind of development?" Her reply came a few seconds later. "We'll discuss it in person. You might want to be there." That message lingered in his mind the rest of the day. That evening, over dinner, Ellen noticed his quiet mood. Something wrong? He told her about the text. She set down her fork, thinking. "Do you think she's causing trouble again?" "Wouldn't surprise me," he said. "Some people can't stand being told no." "Maybe she's finally realizing what she did," Ellen offered hopefully. "Maybe," he said softly. "But people like her don't apologize easily. They double down or disappear." The following days passed quietly, but bits of gossip started surfacing. June stopped by while walking her dog and leaned on the fence, speaking in a hushed tone. "Heard from someone on the board that Karen's been sending emails, long ones, complaints about being targeted and mistreated. She's saying the board's biased." Mark sighed. "She's not backing down then." "Doesn't look like it. But from what I hear, folks aren't taking her seriously anymore." That gave Mark a little relief. Maybe, just maybe, the community had learned something from all this. The next Tuesday evening, Mark and Ellen walked to the HOA building again. The setting sun painted the street gold, and people were chatting in small groups outside the entrance. It felt different this time, not nervous, but curious. Inside, the board was already seated. Mrs. Parker gave Mark a small, reassuring nod as he took a seat near the front. Karen was there too. Her hair was pulled back tightly, and she had another stack of papers in her lap. Her expression was firm but not smug, more defensive maybe. Mrs. Parker called the meeting to order. "Thank you all for coming. Tonight we'll be addressing a follow-up matter regarding last month's complaints and subsequent behavior in the community." Karen raised her hand before anyone else could speak. "I'd like to start if I may." Mrs. Parker hesitated, then nodded. "Go ahead." Karen stood, papers trembling slightly in her hand. "I've lived in this neighborhood for 12 years. I've worked hard to keep it safe and beautiful. I've done more for this community than most people realize.